Monté CrisToph Literature presents Dillinger Comes to Dinner, a novella by Lord Toph, narrated by Ross Allen.
Chapter 1. The Name's Jack. It was late afternoon on a Saturday in mid-November of 1933. I believe the date of the month, to be exact, would have been Saturday, November 18th. The skies were partly cloudy, with puffy clouds bearing smeared edges, which wisped and dissipated like gray gun smoke in the sky. And in close proximity, the mechanical stampeding sound of a locomotive could be heard clearly as it passed on by. My grandmother, Ernestine, was in the kitchen preparing supper for her family of 5, which was almost ready to be placed on the dining room table, while my grandfather finished with his outdoor cleaning by sweeping the front steps and sidewalk after raking the lodged, damp leaves from the gutter below the gable. The children were all happily frolicking among the chickens in the backyard, whose necks were crooked among the dirt as they busily pecked for seeds. Zarita, Calvin, Minnie, and Mamie were all playing Simon Says until it was time for them to be called inside to eat. My aunt, Zarita, was the oldest child, a teenager at age 14. Calvin was next in line at 9. Minnie was next at 7. And the youngest one, who was 2, was my mother, Mamie. The cheerful siblings were too occupied at the time to notice anything seemingly peculiar or offbeat, so they completely missed the man who appeared to be a total stranger walking from the south end of Hickory Street. The few neighbors who did happen to notice the man peeped from behind closed drapes or blinds in the windows of their quiet houses as he passed by. But they closed them quickly in order to avoid his solicitations while they safely stayed inside. But her husband, Luther Muldrow, had been too busy ignoring my grandmother's wishes by doing outdoor chores instead of resting on Saturday. In making his way down the ladder after cleaning out the gutters, "Need a hand there, mister?" is what he heard the stranger say. Grandfather had to be a bit alarmed at first as he came down the ladder with his back facing the road, especially when he turned around to see a man standing there, and it was a face he didn't know. It was a close-knit and rather small community in North Little Rock, Arkansas, so all the people who lived there were quite familiar with each other. My grandfather, Luther, had come all the way up from Hope, Arkansas to live there along with Clifton Muldrow, his older brother. Coincidentally, both of the Muldrow brothers married women named Ernestine, who were both beautiful, well-raised, and young. Clifton married Ernestine Taylor, and Luther married Ernestine Anderson. Clifton and his wife lived in the last house on the block of Hickory Street, which happened to be the closest house near the railroad tracks. It was a wide, deep ditch which separated their plot of land from the railroad, which was directly in the back. Hopping trains was a common thing for hobos, landlopers, vagabonds, or wanderers of this time, and most were usually harmless people with no ill intent in mind. The Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, and Cotton Belt train lines ran at least 2 to 3 times a day, so it could be easy for a daring adventurer or even a rebellious renegade to make his way. So, perhaps this stranger may have made his way into the neighborhood by the same means of quote-unquote borrowed transportation in hopes that he might find some good citizen to help improve his current situation. Neither the Thompsons, Jacksons, nor the Tysons saw him make his way up the Muldrow steps, and no one happened to be outside when he asked Luther Muldrow for help. So, before my grandfather answered the man offering assistance, he took a quick but careful look at him, and just in case the fellow presented any form of danger, he wanted to make sure that Grandmother Ernestine had already called the children in. As Luther took a swift look at the stranger again, he smiled and shook his head to answer no, as he listened to the children's noise coming from inside the house. With the front door open and the screen door shut, he knew the children were safe inside talking to their mother, which meant he was the only one who was still out. So, Being conscious not to bring any attention to him speaking with the stranger, Luther kept his voice down low. "May I come on up and talk with you, mister?" the stranger asked softly, out of consideration for my grandfather with family inside, keeping his voice down also. "I suppose it'll be all right," replied Luther, after finally removing his right foot from the ladder and turning to face the unfamiliar man. He was still a bit leery of the unexpected visitor, but felt obliged as the stranger politely extended his hand. "The name's Jack, sir," said the stranger, and grandfather responded. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Jack. I'm Luther Muldrow." "Are you looking for a particular address?" was his next question, wondering if there was someone else in the neighborhood that the stranger might have known. "No, Mr. Muldrow, I'm not. You see, at the moment I'm in between travel destinations, and I wound up here in this here neighborhood of you good folks with the wild notion I could find some place to, rest my hat a bit." But whatever request or favor the soft-spoken stranger had in mind during the time of his brief introduction, he didn't come right out and ask for it. Grandfather Luther noticed immediately that the stranger wasn't dressed like a street tramp or your typical hobo. He could also tell this man was somewhat of an intellectual, or at least had a sharp measure of common sense, just from judging by the way that he spoke. He didn't have a southern drawl or twang, and Luther noticed this as well. And from the appearance of the man's attire, he had good taste in clothing, as this was easy for Luther to tell. Jack, as the stranger introduced himself, had on a light blue Oxford blend shirt with camel-colored garbardine trousers and a taupe-colored lightweight windbreaker, with light brown wing-tip shoes, which were made of good quality leather and relatively clean apart from the mud. He wore a matching belt made of genuine alligator. Within the short window of time filled with friendly small talk which was struck up by the stranger, Luther listened to him in agreement, courteously as he carried on, as any good Samaritan would. But while the stranger spoke about the pleasant weather they were having, Luther could not keep from asking himself, "Now how did this fellow come about being in our neighborhood?" By our neighborhood, Luther meant himself, his family, along with the folks who had been living there for years, happily raising their children ever since he and his wife had moved in. And to put it bluntly, he also could have meant this by going off the color of the man's skin. Although he was a Caucasian man, he had a dark complexion with a blemish or mole between his thick eyebrows and fine, straight brunette hair. He sported a thin mustache which complemented his distinctively noticeable cleft chin and possessed a dark-eyed, far-away stare. Not that my grandfather was a prejudiced man at all. It was just not a common thing to find a Caucasian man leisurely walking around in their community, unless it was the mailman, milkman, or an officer of the law. A white person would seldom be seen on Hickory Street. There were Beech, Hazel, Walnut, Vine, and Cedar Streets, then Hickory, and next were the railroad tracks. So, by clever speculation, Luther figured he'd had to have hopped a train, jumped off, and come up from the back. The fresh layer of mud on the man's shoes was also a visual sign which gave Luther another clue. Figuring the stranger might have been a little exhausted, Luther said, "Would you like to take a quick rest here on the steps?" And the stranger replied, "That's awfully kind of you, Mr. Muldrow, sir. Don't mind if I do." Then together, the two men took a squat on the second step of the steps which led up to the front porch. They each released a long exhale from the activities of the day, which they had completed just before. "I have to compliment you on your yard, Mr. Muldrow. You done a good job out here, and you got it looking mighty fine." "Why, thank you, Mr. Jack," Luther explained. "My neighbors always keep their yard up, so the least I can do is make sure I do the same with mine. And, by the way, you don't have to call me Mr. Muldrow. Luther will be fine," he added kindly. "Then Luther it is," the stranger accepted. "And so you know, Jack is fine by me." With a chuckle and sitting side by side on the steps, both men nodded at one another as they shook hands for a second time. Although this stranger Jack seemed completely harmless as long as he sat there on the steps, Luther still knew he needed to find out exactly what was on his mind.
"Mama,
Who is Daddy talking to outside?
Calvin, the only Muldrow boy, asked his mother as she placed the food in silver-plated serving dishes for the children to help her carry them from the kitchen to the table.
Baby, I don't know. Probably Mr. Tyson or Clifton Muldrow. But you need to tell your daddy it's time for him to come on in now and get his hands washed as soon as he's able.
As Grandmother Ernestine and Zarita carried the food into the dining room, they heard just above a whisper,
It's a white man, Mama.
Come from Minnie.
Surely is.
Came from Calvin, and Mamie uttered it too.
Shush. Now, keep your voices down.
Ernestine earnestly ordered the children out of respect for her husband conversing with the man.
Now, close the door some more, but leave it cracked a bit,
she told Zarita, because being the oldest of the four, she knew Zarita would understand. Ernestine wanted to be respectful of her husband speaking to the man, so she at least gave them a bit of privacy. But at the same time, she wanted to keep an attentive ear to the door in case the man got disrespectful towards Luther, so the door bore a considerable gap so she could see. When enough had been said about how well Luther had been maintaining his yard, Jack finally opened up a bit more. He told Luther how he had just come up from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and was headed back to Chicago, which is where he was before. Grandfather Luther wasn't the kind of man to try to pry into a person's business, so if Jack never shared a bit of information about what he had been doing in Hot Springs, Luther figured then it was certainly no business of his. Contrary or rather unknown to popular belief at the time, Hot Springs, Arkansas was nothing less than an oasis for the gangster, the bookie, the bootlegger, the gambler, the hooker, and all else who meandered outside legal lines. With crooked cops on the take of God knows who during this era, Hot Springs was a safe haven from the Arlington Hotel over to the Southern Club. One could even stop off at the Hattery to indulge in a little quote-unquote Southern hospitality with the ladies of the evening before going out to enjoy the rest of this hedonistic hub. From the gambling tables to the bordellos and horse races, there was plenty of entertainment for outlaws who vacationed there, and many kept secret homes. This little southern city was a prime retreat for famous mob bosses like Owen, quote-unquote, Oni Madden, Charles, quote-unquote, Lucky Luciano, and Alphonse, quote-unquote, Al Capone. Being the quiet man that he was, Luther didn't rattle off too much, and Jack really respected that. It was a man-to-man understanding that Jack was trying to head back home, get back on his feet, and those were just the basic facts. Being the Christian man he was also, Luther was curious to know what church Jack belonged to, and Jack confessed he didn't have one, but that God was definitely in his heart. Luther looked up at the sky, then smiled as he rested his arms on the step behind him, and in admiration of Jack's reply, told Jack that that was all he needed to make a fresh start. "I appreciate you saying that, Luther," Jack said as he shook his head and amiably patted Luther on his left shoulder. He admired Luther for his conviction in his faith and showed respect for Luther being quite a few years older. After getting everything placed on the table, except the cornbread which had been kept in the oven so it could stay warm, Ernestine walked to the front door and lifted her head to look down the steps to make sure that her husband wasn't facing any harm. In those days in the Deep South, it was not a common thing to see a white person casually chatting with a black person and no less accepting them as their peer. Racism as well as segregation was still alive and well in many places throughout the North, much like the South, which meant lynching of Negroes still occurred and was commonly feared. So, naturally, Grandmother Ernestine kept guard inside the house with the children while waiting for her husband to come inside for supper, while quietly instructing Calvin on what to say politely to get Daddy to come in. She had to quiet the other children from excitedly interrupting her. Zarita went to sit in her father's chair, which sat by the front living room window, and began discreetly peeping from behind the curtains so that she could see outside. Minnie was busy at trying to give a consecutive 5-second report of what was being said by the two men, as she took it upon herself to confide.
"Mama, I just heard him tell Daddy something about Hot Springs,"
declared Minnie excitedly as she was firmly told to come away from the door, and Zarita was told to shut the curtains a second time before her mother said sharply, "Now I don't want to have to tell you no more."
Although Calvin was the soft-spoken child of the four, nevertheless he was still the male. He was already very protective of his mother and his sisters at a mere age of 9. In addition to this, he followed directions well. As a trusting soul, eventually Luther did share a few stories with Jack from his many years of work along the railroad. Luther could tell by Jack's expression and how he intently listened that there were things of which Jack might have wanted to share with him as well, but Jack's reservations expressed that he was carrying a fairly heavy load. A good moment of silence went by with both men looking up at the speckled sky as they watched the blackbirds flying further south for winter. Luther finally minded another gap with words when he courteously asked, "Hey, Jack, how would you like to join me and my family for dinner?"
"Why, that sounds like a winner," Jack said as he stretched out his legs and then asked, "Now, are you sure about that, Luther? 'Cause I don't mean to impose."
"Well, when was the last time you had some good old home-style Southern cooking?" Luther proudly inquired before Jack sighed and answered,
"My goodness, Luther, only heaven knows."
"And besides, man ain't got no business traveling a long distance without getting a good amount of sustenance in his stomach. There's no point in eating unless you're gonna get something from it."
These were the wise words coming from a hard-working family man that had spent well over half of his life working in factories and on the rail. Luther's tales of labor were written all over his hands, and Jack could clearly tell. Jack had a keen eye and could sense a lot by a fellow, an absolute stranger, let alone a friend. He knew whether a man was an honest one or a liar and could smell a coward from 100 miles away due to the line of work that he was involved in. So, reading a man's hands was no problem for him, but he was glad to know that through decent conversation he was becoming more acquainted with Luther Muldrow. Luther, in turn, eased up on his skepticism of Jack and just accepted him as being an ambitious fella from out of town, who he was given the pleasure to get to know. A few seconds' gaze with that deadpan stare of his gave Jack the push he finally needed to tell Luther a little about his life. Without being too vague, or too specific, Jack mentioned he had gotten into some trouble when he was a bit younger, and in the process of it all, that was when he lost the love of his life, Beryl, his wonderful wife. Yet, since then, despite the heartbreak, he had managed to move on, make somewhat of a name for himself up there in Chicago, and he was glad to finally be getting back on his feet. Jack made sure to mention that he would like to share something else with Luther much later on for inviting him in for supper, right before Luther was called in by his son to eat. Calvin was told to go out nicely, after being informed what to say by his mother, and retrieve his daddy while the girls were told to go wash their hands, and come back to the table to take their seats. Calvin did exactly as he was told, and said,
"Excuse me, Daddy, Mister, but Mama just want me to let you know that dinner's already on the table and it's time to eat."
Upon hearing Calvin's meek little voice, both Luther and Jack turned around to acknowledge the little messenger.
"Okay, son,"
Luther said as he beckoned for Calvin to come down the steps, whispered in his ear, then said,
"Now you run that message into it." "Yes, sir,"
Calvin said to his father enthusiastically as he looked at the strange man with a gleaming grin. Jack looked at Calvin while giving his best dimpled, lopsided smile, then winked before Calvin rushed right in. Calvin ran back inside the house and all the way back to the kitchen to find his mother opening the oven to take out the hot, fresh baked cornbread.
Mama,
he said in between breaths of anxiousness before he announced to her what his father had said.
Mama, Daddy told me to ask you to put another plate on the table so his friend can eat dinner with us."
Calvin said this so hurriedly that it had come out jumbled the first time, so his mother told him to repeat it without being in such a rush.
"Now, what is it, baby?"
Ernestine said curiously, and Calvin calmly re-delivered his father's message.
"Oh, well, okay,"
she answered apprehensively, while knowing neither she nor her husband knew this man from Adam, but thought,
"Now, I'm curious to find out who this new friend of Luther's is."
Walking back to the dining room from the kitchen with the cornbread buttered, cut into healthy squares and stacked neatly on the serving plate, Ernestine could hear the voices of the two men as they were jovially bringing their conversation in and speaking just as lively as two old schoolmates. Ernestine never skipped a beat as she watched the unfamiliar white man walking into her household, who had clearly been a stranger no more than half an hour before. It was,
"Why, hello. I'm Luther's wife, Ernestine,"
she announced as Jack courteously stood by, keeping space between him and the table as he waited for Luther, who was behind him, closing, then locking the front door. With hat already in his right hand and held against his stomach, Jack cordially introduced himself. "It's very nice to meet you, Ernestine, ma'am," he said humbly as he nodded and from the back adjusted his belt. Jack made sure to step back as Luther passed him to walk towards the table, but this was taken as a courtesy and wasn't looked at as being anything odd at all. But Jack was conscious of his body positioning at all times while he was in the house and subtly made sure he kept his back facing the wall. As invited dinner guest, Jack smiled and waited patiently until Ernestine said, "Okay, you two good men go on in there and wash your hands." Being escorted by Luther and on his way into the bathroom, he smiled at all the children as he followed Luther while tugging on his back belt loop to give a readjustment to his belt again. With Luther being the head of the household, Jack thoughtfully insisted for Luther to go right ahead and wash his hands first. Luther did so, and when he was done, he showed Jack where the clean hand towels were. "Okay, Jack, come on in the dining room after you're all done," said Luther, "and just feel free to pull up a chair. I'm going to go on in here and get these youngsters to settle down. I'll be waiting for you in there." As Luther turned to walk across the hall to go into the dining room, Jack called to get his attention very quietly. "Yes, Jack," Luther answered, and Jack replied, "I was about to drum up a little courage to ask you for a little bite of something before I left. I surely wasn't expecting no dinner. Hell, a sandwich would have been all right by me." As he pulled a towel from the bathroom rack to dry his hands, Jack said, "Thanks again." Then Luther walked off into the dining room after humbly acknowledging him. After Jack came out of the bathroom, across the hall, and back into the dining room, he saw 4 sets of big, innocent, eager eyes peering up at him. Zarita, Calvin, Minnie, and Mamie all were sitting quietly and smiling when Jack returned a smile right before complimenting them. "You kids are some well-mannered children." As he sat down, he looked over at Luther and Ernestine, then added, "You two have done a pretty swell job with raising them." Ernestine smiled and nodded, showing gratitude to Jack with a pleased expression on her face. "I thank you, Mr. Jack. We try to do our best," she mentioned before asking Jack if he would like to do the honors in saying grace. Jack's expression quickly went from being dark to rosy as he responded by saying, "Oh, no, ma'am, Miss Ernestine. I'll pass, 'cause I get all tangled up in my words." Luther relieved Jack from any tension of being put on the spot as he proceeded in delivering what was perhaps the best dinner table prayer Jack had ever heard. As everyone bowed their heads, held hands, and respectfully waited for my grandfather Luther to finish saying grace, Jack held both Zarita and Calvin's hand. They each peeped across at one another before they looked at Jack, sitting with his eyes closed and head down, before closing their eyes again. "Heavenly Father, please make us truly thankful for the blessings we are about to receive and the nourishment for our bodies. In Christ our Redeemer's sake we pray. We ask that you watch over our guest and friend who you have invited into our home and in his travels home, Lord. We ask that you see him safely on his way. We ask that you accept our humble prayers and bless this table of food prepared before us, O Lord, who art in heaven and watches us from up high. And we pray that you will look over us, Father, through life, in sickness and in good health, and long after we die." Quietly, everyone followed suit and sang Amen in unison when Luther concluded in saying grace. Jack then looked over at the littlest child, Mamie, and wiggled his nose to put a big grin on her face. All the children giggled diffidently, and Minnie whispered something to Calvin as she cupped the right side of her mouth and spoke into his ear. She had just been dying to say something about the stranger, but didn't necessarily want anyone else to hear. "Minnie, honey, we don't whisper at the table. It's not polite, especially in front of guests." With this being said to Minnie by her mother, along with the subtle expression of discipline, Minnie immediately understood it was time to give the whispering a rest. As Ernestine politely asked Jack to pass his plate along so that she could fill it with food, he modestly passed it to Zarita, and she extended her reach past little Mamie to hand it to her mother with no intention of being rude. It's just that little Mamie could not have been any older than 2.5, so she hadn't quite gotten her dexterity at handling things together yet. But she was more than delighted to assist in preparing Mr. Jack's plate with food, as she reached out for the plate anyway, and was just about as happy as any child could get. She had to have spouted out, "Hi," to Jack at least 3 times at the table before she was finally told to hush and to sit up straight in her high chair. Jack displayed his innate knack for congeniality each time she had done so by waving at her while the other children tried hard not to stare. And speaking of staring, Jack all but gaped over the food in favorable amazement as he sat patiently looking at the array of southern-cooked cuisine while Ernestine generously filled his plate. "Everything looks so darn delicious," he expressed with carefully tucking his napkin below his collar as he got geared up to eat, although he could hardly wait. Before him, there were mashed potatoes, turnip greens, and a large bowl filled with fresh purple hull peas. Of course, there was the hot batch of buttered cornbread, and a large pan of baked macaroni. "Oh, that's a plenty, Luther," Jack expressed to Luther as he sliced a hearty piece of slow-cooked tender pot roast to place on Jack's plate as Ernestine held it out for him. "You sure?" Luther questioned, and Jack replied, "Yeah, I'm just passing through, but you gotta have plenty left to feed these children." If Jack didn't say anything else at the dinner table after that, Ernestine would have still been content. She could see the sincerity in his eyes as he considered her children and knew what he said was what he meant. She was far more wary of traveling strangers than her husband was, and as far as she was concerned, they probably all were just shisty, wandering troubadours. She didn't trust or rate them any higher than she would vagrants, winos, pimps, or whores. But there were a few things that she liked about this Jack fellow that the cat and her husband had just dragged in. He was clean-cut, well-mannered, didn't slouch down at the table or use profanity, and quite respectfully, he seemed to fit right in. With food on everyone's plates and enough left to go around for seconds, Luther considered it a blessed and more than satisfying meal. He was so pleased to look around to see that all his children were healthy, happy, had each other, parents who loved them, and that were together still. "After so many years," he thought to himself as he reached over to hold Ernestine's left hand with his right, "I still love this woman sitting next to me, and I'm so fortunate to have her in my life." Ernestine smiled at Luther, as if she'd heard his train of thought, while he held her hand. He smiled at her, rubbed his fingers gently across the back of hers, then looked across the table at his new acquaintance. "Jack, how we doing down there?" Luther asked as he lifted his voice vivaciously. "Huh?" Jack asked playfully upon lifting his head as if he had gotten lost in his dinner plate of delicious food, and all the children roared ecstatically. "Why are you little rascals laughing at me?" Jack inquired comically, and they all overflowed with giggles once again. Jack then turned his head to look over at Luther and Ernestine and pronounced, "I haven't had food this good since, I don't know when. Miss Ernestine, I have to tell you, this cornbread just melts in your mouth just as soon as you go to eat it." "Well, I'm so glad you're enjoying yourself," Ernestine said before saying, "Hold the plate over to him so he can get himself another piece, Zarita." Young Zarita courteously held the plate for Mr. Jack and blushed from him, saying, "Thank you, dear." Luther smiled admirably as he said, "Glad to have you join us, Jack." And Jack came back with, "Well, Luther, I'm mighty glad to be here." Each and every one of the children had warmed up well by now to this tall, nice-looking, funny stranger named Mr. Jack. They were glad he had shown up on their doorstep coming from wherever he had come, and were already looking forward to their parents having him back. Zarita, aside from her being the oldest, was much like her mother, observant, cautious, yet still sweet. Every so often she would cut her eyes over at Jack to watch how he held his fork, brushed his dark, brown hair back behind his left ear, or would sneak a peek down at his feet. Calvin did his best at slyly imitating Jack's actions and how he chewed. He was simply fascinated by Jack's gestures. He didn't mean to do this by being rude. But caught in the act by his sister Minnie, she whispered across the table, "Mama, tell Calvin to stop being a copycat." All it took was the slightest raise of an eyebrow and a glare across the table at Calvin from Ernestine for there to be no more of that. But Calvin wasn't satisfied at just watching Jack. He was so anxious to ask him questions so that Jack would say something good. So, cleverly, he asked his father instead of his mother if he could ask Mr. Jack a question, hoping Luther would say he could. "Daddy?" came out more like, "Daddy, Back in this day, and I know this for a fact because I said it this way for the longest. Later on in life, it was hard for me to decipher whether my southern accent or my slow, sing-songy rhythm in using words and their syllables was the strongest. But nevertheless, I know little Calvin could not have addressed his father any differently than I did, because I can still remember vividly how he would say my mother's name when I was just a kid. He'd say, Mamie, Mamie, or Mamie. All three had different and distinct inflections, depending on the context of the conversation. But this could vary also, especially if he had been made to feel happy, sad, or vexed by a particular situation. But nevertheless, Calvin must have known from a child how to garner attention, empathy, or even sympathy by the use of his inflections. And, typically, most children still do primarily in the South, as they have mastered this technique, which they have made affectionately infectious. Calvin shyly asking his father, "Daddy, may I ask Mr. Jack a question?" came out nice and slow. Luther told him, "He's eating, son." But Jack was curious about what Calvin wanted to know, so he said, "I don't mind, Luther. Let the little fella ask whatever's on his mind." Luther supposed about the best time for the children to get acquainted with any house guest was during dinner time. So he said, "Okay, son, what is it you wanted to ask Mr. Jack?" What it was that Calvin wanted to know was where Jack's home was and how he was going to get back. Jack told him proudly, "Little man, I live in the big old town of Chicago, better known as the Windy City. You should get your mom and daddy to bring you up there sometime. It's got a lot of tall buildings and everybody dresses up nice and pretty." Calvin grinned as he sat picturing this busy place as it was being described by Mr. Jack, but he didn't forget to ask his other question.
"So, how are you gonna get back?"
Jack chuckled as he covered his mouth with his napkin as he chewed. Humored by Calvin's inquisitiveness, he responded with, "Little man, ain't nobody gonna be able to pull nothing over on you." Luther thought it was so funny, and so did Ernestine. The other children found it to be hilarious, but Calvin sat there perplexed and wondering. Jack could see that the boy was seriously concerned about how he was going to be able to orchestrate his upcoming journey back home. He previously didn't show up in a car, a bus, on a wagon, horse, or streetcar, and they all knew he came alone. "You're really worried about how I'm going to make it back home, aren't you, little man?" Calvin shook his head innocently, and Jack made sure to answer him to help him understand. Jack reached out and rubbed Calvin's head as he told him with all jokes aside, "I know somebody's going to be leaving out in the morning, and I'm going to catch a ride." Catch a ride could have meant anything from hitch a ride to carpool to hitchhike or tag along, but Jack made sure to use his words carefully so they wouldn't be taken wrong. Then Minnie got the courage to ask him,
"Mr. Jack, have you ever had an automobile before?"
"Sure, sugar," he modestly boasted as he told her. "I got a 1931 Chevrolet pickup truck and a new DeSoto waiting for me back there in Chicago, and I've had plenty more."
"Can they go fast?"
Which was a question Zarita pitched in, and Jack turned to look at her and answered, "You bet, honey. They sure do, just like the wind."
"Pulling their legs is all."
That's what Ernestine thought as Jack told the children his daring stories about how many automobiles he had owned, driven, how fast they were, and how he had driven them so far.
"He's just making all this up for the sake of entertaining the children. Who on earth have I ever known to own so many motor cars?"
But Jack wasn't fibbing to the children. As many folks already knew, he had come by many cars, by many means, but the sensible question would have been, how had he been acquiring them? As long as it was the children doing the interrogating, Jack was fine, because this way he could go through his head and throw just about anything into the mix to make each tale more interesting, and he did this with whatever came to mind. Or he could just skip over the one part of the story and with excitement in his eyes tell another for the kids. Either way it went, the children were all eyes and ears, whether Jack was telling them about how he had once found a buffalo nickel on a ferry boat ledge, or how he got to meet one of the famous Ringling brothers at the circus.
"All right, now, I want y'all to settle down and fill your mouths and clean your plates. Quit asking Mr. Jack questions. Leave the man alone so he can eat."
When Ernestine said this imperatively, the children did so obediently, and Jack said, "Oh, Miss Ernestine, I don't mind it. It's been my treat." He never once mentioned politics or religion at the table, which some folks back then considered to be two subjects that were too obtrusive and rather rude to mention during dinner. However, Ernestine did mention she overheard him talking to Luther about hot springs and asked if he was a gambling man, to which Jack replied, "Well, ma'am, I'd have to say that I'm just a beginner." Quite smoothly, though, he schmoozed his way out of being summed up as a two-bit penny hustler before any judgmental interrogation arose. Being a sharp censor himself, he could easily recognize another, and knew Ernestine Muldrow was civilly sensing him out with her cleverly intuitive nose. But with Jack being the silver-tongued devil that he was able to steer clear of any roadblocks or warning signals that Ernestine may have kept on reserve. If there was one thing Ernestine learned about this stranger who sat opposite to her husband at the head of the table, was that he was very good with words. After the gambling man question was asked, and Jack had given Ernestine a meek yet substantial answer, everyone seemed to continue on with eating their meal until Jack thought of something he wanted to ask her. "Miss Ernestine, do you mind me asking you a question?" And she replied, "Of course not, Mr. Jack. Go right ahead." Luther and the children all looked on curiously as they waited for Jack to finish chewing his bit of pot roast, and this is what he said. "Did you ever race other kids from corner to corner, or down old country dirt roads when you were a young girl?" was the question Jack asked. Ernestine had to laugh in spite of herself before she answered him, then said, "Oh, I did, and I tell you, I was fast." The children laughed, as did Luther and Jack, as she continued. "See, there was me, Mamie, like this baby here. I gave my youngest girl my sister's name. Then there was Leah, Miletus, and my brother Jimmy. We all just called him brother," she explained. "Nearly every Sunday after church, we'd all put on our play clothes, old worn-out tennis shoes, to race and see who could run from the front steps to this rickety old railroad sign. With Miletus being the baby girl, she wasn't too fast, but Mamie, Leah, and Jimmy, shoot, I'd beat them every time." Jack placed his knife and fork down on his plate and listened attentively to every nostalgic detail Luther's wife, Ernestine, had mentioned. She even extended her racing tale a bit more after being given Jack's undivided attention. With shirt sleeves folded midway up his forearms, Jack rested his elbows on the table as Ernestine spoke. And the children giggled at every funny detail of their mother's story, as if it were some funny yet elaborately old-fashioned joke. Luther was happy to see his wife gladly entertaining Jack as she reminisced, and after Ernestine finished telling her racing story, Jack started in with his. "You see, Miss Ernestine, this is how my story goes. When I was a kid, I never was too good in school, and at running, well, I was pretty slow. With my grades far below fair to middling in school, I kind of got picked on a lot. And whenever I had in my lunch bag or in my pockets, them old bullies that were much older than me, much bigger than me, they were always taking wherever I got." At this point of Jack's portion of dinner talk, Luther, Ernestine, as well as the children found it much too distracting to try to eat. They were all set on hearing what happened next as Jack paused to lean back and stretch in his seat. The shy but inquisitive daughter, Minnie, couldn't resist, so she asked him, "What did you do about it, Mr. Jack?" Exhaling from his stretch, he said, "Well, fortunately I got older. It didn't bother me no more, but I never got the chance to get him back. But one fine day when I was old enough, a friend of mine's father, you see, he took his son and me to the horse track. And that's when I first fell in love with what it meant to run real fast, like them pretty horses, beating folks by running the best race, instead of trying to get him back." Although Jack was explaining his story by looking at young Minnie and the rest of the children, Luther and Ernestine could clearly understand the meaning as well as its moral by the time Jack was bringing it back around the bend. He felt that over time, he had adapted a racing horse as a metaphor for his life. He didn't plan on ever losing again, and he was confident about becoming the fastest horse and being the winner in the end. With sympathy for his story, Ernestine felt he deserved it and offered him a second helping. He rubbed his stomach and passed on having seconds reluctantly, but said that after having such good food and fine dinner company, he felt more like himself again. Not too long after this, everyone was finished with their food except Luther. He announced to Jack as Ernestine removed everyone else's plates, "I've always been a slow chewer. Ernestine teases me all the time about how long it takes for me to chew my food and swallow it."
Luther found it better for his digestion to take his time, and so he could enjoy every bit. After Ernestine stood, she said to Jack,
"I know you can at least make a little room for a nice slice of some pie."
After Jack found out it was sweet potato and made from scratch, He leaned back in his chair again and replied to her. "Oh, Miss Ernestine, I'm sure gonna try." Ernestine smiled and nodded at Jack as she would one of her neighboring friends. She then called young Zarita away from the table so that she could go assist her in the kitchen again. 2 warm, homemade sweet potato pies had been sitting on the kitchen stove just waiting to be cut. The crust was perfectly brown with flaky edges around the pies, complexion somewhere between cinnamon and butternut. Zarita pulled the silverware drawer out to take out clean forks, which were to be placed on the paper towels she folded on the kitchen counter. She ducked her head a bit as she took them out so that her mother could open the cabinet door above her head and maneuver around her. Ernestine took down from one of the cabinet shelves her best set of what is referred to today as depression glass. She had only used these dishes on holidays or special occasions in the past. Yet she figured, as unexpected as this visit and dinner with a complete stranger was, it had actually turned out to be rather nice. As she cut one of the pies, she cut her usual size pieces, but for Jack, she cut a larger slice. "Wow," Zarita said as she watched her mother lift the big slice of pie from the pan. "Is that piece for Daddy or Mr. Jack?"
You know your daddy ain't gonna eat a piece that big,"
Ernestine replied with a snicker while placing the dish towel on the dish rack. Zarita laughed in agreement and helped her mother carry the plates with pie into the dining room. In doing this, she could hardly wait to see Mr. Jack's expression. Fortunately for my family, they could all eat well and still have enough to go around, especially during America's Great Depression. The fresh sliced, homemade sweet potato pie made its way to the Muldrow dining room table, with Zarita getting to present the largest piece to their friendly, unexpected guest. She sat her piece down on the table where she had been sitting, then served Mr. Jack his piece, and Ernestine took care of serving the rest. Luther smirked in a humorous way of wanting to hear what Jack would say about the extra large slice of pie as he looked at his wife Ernestine. For at least a good 10 seconds of being stricken with disbelief, Jack just stared at his plate without being able to say anything. The first words out of his mouth as he looked up from his more than generous portion of dessert were, "Zarita, honey, I thought you were on my side, but now I know you and your mother are out to get me." The whole family laughed out loud, and as soon as Jack found space to add another remark, he kindly said, "Miss Ernestine, that's about the best-looking piece of sweet potato pie I've ever seen." Following Jack's compliment, and after Luther took his first bite, he told Ernestine, "Honey, I think this one's your best yet." For all her hard work she did around the house, raising their children, chickens, and hogs, Luther felt his wife deserved all his compliments because, beside himself, she was the hardest working person he had ever met. A few comments were made by the girls as they had their first bite or two, but the comment Calvin had was,
"It seems like today is Thanksgiving."
A few wise words to serve as food for thought came with Jack saying, "Well, little man, I suppose every day is Thanksgiving, as long as we're healthy, safe, and living." These were righteous words coming from a man he had never met before, but they still rang true enough for Luther to reply, "Amen." Although he knew Jack admitted not to be a church-going man, Luther could still gather that Jack was spiritual in his own way, and his experiences had taught him enough about life for him to understand.
Dillinger Comes to Dinner by Lord Toph. This has been a Monté CrisToph literature presentation.